Tom Holloway had been farming the same 300 acres in eastern Montana for 42 years. He was 61 years old, and he knew every inch of his land the way some men know the lines on their own hands. He knew where the ground went soft in May. He knew which fence posts would lean after a hard winter. He knew where the deer crossed and where the spring ran cold even in August. And he knew what was buried in the bottom land on the property next to his. He had known since he was 19 years old, the summer his father told him the story and made him promise never to forget it. The land next to the Holloway farm was called the Pruitt Place. 5,000 acres of rolling pasture, timber, and river bottom that had been in the Pruitt family since 1903. Tom's father had grown up with the Pruitt brothers, had helped them work cattle, had stood at their father's funeral in 1967. And in the spring of 1952, Tom's father had been there when the Pruitts made a decision that would stay buried for 70 years. It started with a wet spring and a diesel fuel spill. The Pruitts ran a large operation for the time. They had 6 Massey Ferguson tractors, all bought between 1948 and 1951. Big machines for that era. Massey Ferguson 40s and 50s. Heavy iron, reliable, the kind of equipment a family operation built itself around. But in April 1952, the main fuel tank at the Pruitt farm developed a crack. It was an old, riveted steel tank, 1,500 gallons, sitting on a wooden frame near the equipment shed. The crack was small at first, maybe a quarter inch, but over the course of 3 days it widened, and by the time anyone noticed, over 400 gallons of diesel had leaked into the ground beneath the tank. This was 1952. There were no environmental regulations, no EPA, no cleanup protocols. The Pruitt brothers stood in the yard and looked at the dark stains spreading through the soil and made a decision. They couldn't afford to lose the fuel, and they couldn't afford to have the county asking questions about contamination. So they did what a lot of farmers did back then. They buried it. They dug a trench 20 feet long and 8 feet deep in the bottom land, down near the old river channel where the ground stayed soft. They pushed the contaminated soil into the trench. And then they decided to bury the tractors too. All 6 Massey Fergusons. Not because the machines were broken, because they were old enough to be replaced, and because burying them in the same trench would cover the fuel contamination and make it look like an equipment disposal site instead of an environmental problem. It was a cold calculation. The tractors still ran, but new models were coming out, and the Pruitts had the cash to upgrade. So they drove all 6 Massey Fergusons into the trench, one after another, parked them in a line, drained the fluids, and buried them under 8 feet of dirt and clay. Tom's father had been there. He was 23 years old, working for the Pruitts as seasonal help. He had helped dig the trench with a borrowed bulldozer. He had watched the tractors roll into the hole, red paint gleaming in the spring sun, engines still capable of running, still valuable, still useful. And then he had watched the dozer push the walls of the trench in on top of them until there was nothing but a long mound of disturbed earth. The Pruitts planted the mound over with grass seed. By the next spring, you couldn't tell anything had been buried there. The land looked like it always had, the bottom field, soft in the spring, prone to flooding in wet years, the kind of ground you didn't build on. The Pruitts never talked about it. Tom's father kept the secret because the Pruitts were his employers and his friends. But in 1981, when Tom was 19 and about to take over the family farm, his father told him. He walked Tom down to the fence line and pointed across to the Pruitt bottom land. He said there were 6 Massey Ferguson tractors buried under that field, along with 400 gallons of diesel-soaked soil. He said the contamination had probably leached into the groundwater by now, but it was deep and it was old, and as long as nobody disturbed it, it would stay there. He made Tom promise to remember. Because if anyone ever tried to dig in that bottom land, they needed to know what was underneath. Tom had kept the promise. For 40 years, he had kept it. The Pruitt brothers died in the 2010s. The last one, Eugene, passed in 2022 at the age of 94. The heirs, none of whom lived in Montana, decided to sell. The land sat on the market for 8 months. It was a big parcel, 5,000 acres, too big for most family operations, too rural for residential development. The asking price was $11 million. In March 2023, Continental Trust Bank bought it outright through their commercial real estate division. The bank had been expanding its agricultural holdings across the northern plains. They bought land, developed it, and leased it back to corporate farming operations or turned it into logistics hubs for agricultural processing. The Pruitt land was perfect for that. It had rail access, it had highway frontage, and it had 5,000 acres of flat to rolling ground that could support large-scale construction. The sale closed in April. By May, the white trucks started showing up. Tom saw them from his kitchen window. 3 trucks with the Continental Trust logo on the doors. Behind them came a surveying rig and a black SUV. They parked at the fence line, and men got out with tablets and rolls of plans. Tom pulled on his jacket and walked down to meet them. There were 4 of them, 3 men and a woman. The woman introduced herself as Lauren Castile, project manager for Continental Trust. She said the bank was planning to develop the Pruitt land into a regional agricultural processing and distribution facility. 3 phases. The first phase would be a large processing building down in the bottom land near the old rail spur. She was polite, professional. She asked if Tom had any concerns about the development. Tom looked past her at the plans spread across the hood of one of the trucks. He could see the layout. The main building was going in the bottom field, right where the Massey Fergusons were buried. Tom said he had a concern. He said the bottom land wasn't suitable for construction. Lauren asked why. Tom said the ground was unstable and there was contamination underneath. Lauren tilted her head. What kind of contamination? Tom took a breath. He said in 1952 the Pruitt family had buried 6 Massey Ferguson tractors in that field, along with 400 gallons of diesel-soaked soil. He said the contamination had been sitting there for 70 years, and if they dug into it, they were going to have a serious environmental problem. One of the men, older, wearing a fleece vest with the bank's logo, looked up from his tablet. He introduced himself as Derek Holm, Vice President of Commercial Real Estate. He asked Tom how he knew this. Tom said his father had been there when it happened. Derek nodded slowly. He said the bank appreciated the information, but they had environmental assessments scheduled, and if there was contamination, the consultants would find it. Tom said the consultants wouldn't find it unless they knew where to look. The tractors were buried deep, and the contamination had leached into the aquifer below the fill. It wasn't on the surface. It was 8 feet down, spread through the gravel layer that ran under the whole bottom field. Derek said the bank used licensed environmental firms. They would drill test borings. They would sample the soil and groundwater. If there was anything there, they would find it. Tom asked where they were planning to drill. Derek showed him the grid on his tablet. 12 test locations spread across the bottom field in a regular pattern. Tom looked at the grid. He knew the buried tractors ran in a line along the old river channel, angled northwest to southeast. The test grid was oriented north-south. The borings would miss the trench by 20 to 30 feet on either side. He told Derek this. Derek said the grid was designed by professionals. It was based on standard environmental assessment protocols. Tom said the protocols wouldn't account for a 70-year-old tractor graveyard that didn't appear in any records. Derek smiled. It was a polite smile. He said if the contamination was as widespread as Tom was suggesting, the borings would intersect it somewhere. Tom said they wouldn't. Not with that grid. Derek thanked him for the information and said the bank would proceed with the assessment. Tom stood at the fence and watched them drive away. He knew what was going to happen. He had told them. They hadn't listened, and now it was out of his hands. The environmental assessment began in June. A consulting firm out of Billings arrived with a drilling rig and a crew of 3. They drilled 12 borings across the bottom field, each one going down to 20 feet. They pulled soil samples every 5 feet and sent them to a lab in Helena. The lab results came back in 2 weeks. No contamination detected. All samples within acceptable limits for agricultural land. The consultant wrote a report. The report said the site was suitable for development. Continental Trust filed the report with the county and received approval to begin construction. The graders arrived in July. Tom watched from his porch. He watched the graders peel the topsoil off the bottom field and push it into long berms on the east side. He watched the excavators dig the foundation pad for the processing building. They had to go down 10 feet for the slab and the loading dock, and at 8 feet, they hit it. The first Massey Ferguson came up on the bucket of a Caterpillar 320 excavator on a Thursday afternoon in late July. The operator had been digging along the north edge of the foundation when the bucket hit something solid. He thought it was a boulder. He repositioned and dug again. The bucket pulled up a chunk of red-painted metal, corroded, covered in clay, but unmistakably a tractor hood. The operator shut down the machine and called the foreman. The foreman climbed down into the cut and looked at it. He called Derek home. Derek drove out from the site office. He stood at the edge of the excavation and stared at the piece of metal in the bottom of the hole. He asked the operator to dig more carefully. The operator did. Over the next 2 hours, they uncovered the front end of a Massey Ferguson tractor. The grill was gone, the engine was seized, the tires had rotted away decades ago, but the frame was intact, and the serial number was still readable on the engine block. Derek called the environmental consultant. The consultant came back out. He took samples from the soil around the tractor. The samples came back hot. Diesel contamination, high levels, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, lead. The soil was saturated. The consultant dug test pits around the tractor and found the contamination extended in both directions. He brought in a backhoe and started trenching. By the end of the week, they had uncovered all 6 Massey Fergusons. They were lined up in a row, just like Tom had said, buried 8 feet deep. Engines, transmissions, hydraulic systems, all of it still there, leaching fluids into the soil for 70 years. The contamination plume extended 40 feet in every direction from the trench. It had soaked into the clay. It had leached into the gravel aquifer below, and it was moving, slowly, downhill, toward the Holloway farm. The Montana Department of Environmental Quality issued a stop work order on August 3rd. Continental Trust had to halt all construction and commission a full environmental remediation study. The study took 6 weeks. The results were bad. The contamination covered over 2 acres. The soil would have to be excavated and removed to a depth of 12 feet. The tractors would have to be pulled out, drained, and disposed of as hazardous waste. The aquifer would have to be monitored for at least 5 years. And the Holloway farm's well, which sat downhill from the site, would have to be tested for contamination. The cost estimate came back at $9.4 million. On top of the $14 million the bank had already spent on land acquisition and initial construction. Derek Holm called a meeting at the county extension office. Tom was invited. So was the environmental consultant. So was a man named Vance, who had flown in from the bank's regional headquarters in Denver. The meeting started with Vance asking Tom to explain how he had known about the tractors. Tom told the story. His father, the Pruitts, the fuel spill in 1952, the decision to bury the contamination and the tractors together. Vance listened without interrupting. When Tom finished, Vance asked why Tom hadn't filed a formal report with the county before construction began. Tom said he had told the bank's representatives in May. He had explained where the contamination was and why the test grid would miss it. He had warned them not to dig in the bottom field. Vance looked at Derek. Derek said Tom had mentioned a concern, but it had seemed anecdotal. There had been no documentation, no records. The environmental assessment had cleared the site. Vance nodded. He asked the consultant why the initial borings had missed the contamination. The consultant said the borings had been placed according to standard grid protocol. The contamination was concentrated in a narrow linear feature oriented at an angle to the grid. It was a statistical miss. Vance asked if the consultant would have changed the grid if he had known about the tractors. The consultant said yes, absolutely, but no one had told him. There was a silence in the room. Vance looked at Tom. He asked if Tom had any documentation of the burial. Tom said no. It had happened in 1952. There were no environmental laws, no permits, no records. The only documentation was his father's memory, passed to him as a verbal warning. Vance asked if Tom's father was still alive. Tom said no. He had died in 2001. Vance made a note. He said the bank would proceed with the remediation. It was required by law. But the cost would be borne by the bank, and the project would be delayed by at least 18 months. He said the bank would also test the Holloway well, and if there was contamination, the bank would provide clean water and remediate Tom's property at their expense. Tom said he appreciated that. Vance said the bank would also like to retain Tom as a consultant on the remainder of the development. They were redesigning the site plan to move the processing facility to the upper bench, away from the bottom land. They wanted Tom's input on ground conditions, drainage, and any other historical issues he was aware of. Tom said he would help. Vance shook his hand. The excavation of the Massey Fergusons took 3 weeks. A specialized remediation crew came in with a crane and lifting slings. They pulled the tractors out one at a time. Each machine weighed over 4,000 pounds, even without the tires. The frames were corroded but intact. The engines were seized solid. Diesel and hydraulic fluid had leaked from every seal and gasket, pooling in the clay and soaking into the soil. The crew loaded the tractors onto flatbed trucks and hauled them to a hazardous waste facility in Billings. Tom went out to watch the day they pulled the first one. It was a Massey Ferguson 50. The same model his grandfather had run in the 1950s. The red paint was almost gone, eaten away by 70 years underground, but the shape was unmistakable. The distinctive grille, the wide fenders, the operator's seat, now just a rusted spring and frame. Tom stood at the fence and watched the crane lift it out of the ground, mud and clay sliding off the frame, fluids dripping from the engine block. It looked like an archaeological dig, like they were pulling up a fossil, and in a way, they were. The Massey Ferguson 50 had been state-of-the-art in 1950. It had been a workhorse, a machine that had helped families build their farms, and the Pruitts had buried 6 of them like they were trash, because it was easier than dealing with a fuel spill. The contaminated soil came out next, over 800 cubic yards of it, diesel-soaked clay and gravel, loaded into lined dump trucks and hauled away. The excavation left a hole 40 feet wide and 12 feet deep. The remediation crew lined the hole with geotextile fabric and backfilled it with clean fill, compacted in layers. When they were done, the bottom field looked like it had been through surgery, a long scar of fresh dirt cutting across the pasture. The DEQ inspector signed off on the work in October. The contamination had been removed. The aquifer monitoring wells were in place. The site could be redeveloped, but not for another 18 months, pending clean test results from the wells. Continental Trust filed an amended site plan. The processing facility was moved to the upper bench, 300 yards east of the original location. The bottom field was placed under a permanent conservation easement. The bank would never build there. It wasn't worth the risk. Tom's well tested clean. The contamination plume had been moving slowly, only about 10 feet per year, and it hadn't reached his property yet. The remediation had stopped it, but the DEQ required Tom to install a monitoring well on his side of the fence, just to be sure. The bank paid for it. They also paid Tom a consulting fee of $15,000 for his input on the new site plan. Tom took the money and put it toward a new truck. In December, Vance came back to Montana. He met Tom at the extension office. He brought a folder with him. Inside was a copy of the final remediation report, professionally bound. On the cover page there was a note. It said, "The Holloway Advisory. Site contamination identified through local historical knowledge provided by Tom Holloway, adjacent landowner. Remediation completed per DEQ requirements. Future development relocated to mitigate risk." Vance said the report would be filed with the county and the state. It would be part of the permanent record. Anyone who looked at the Pruitt land in the future would see Tom's name and know that he had tried to warn them. Tom read the note twice. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked Vance why the bank was doing this. Vance said because Tom had been right and the bank had been wrong, and that needed to be in the record. He said the bank had made a mistake by not listening, and mistakes needed to be acknowledged, not buried. By the spring of 2024, the new processing facility was under construction on the upper bench. The foundation was solid, the drainage was good, there were no surprises. Tom watched the progress from his porch. The building went up fast. Steel frame, metal cladding, loading docks. By summer, it was operational. a regional distribution hub for agricultural products. It employed 43 people. It brought commerce to the area. It did exactly what the bank had planned, just not where they had planned to do it. The bottom field stayed empty. Grass grew over the remediation scar. The DEQ wells were checked every quarter. The water stayed clean. The contamination was gone. And 6 Massey Ferguson tractors, which had been buried in 1952 to hide a mistake, were finally gone too, disposed of properly, 70 years too late. Tom turned 62 in May. He still farmed the same 300 acres. He still knew every inch of his land. And now, when he walked the fence line and looked across at the Pruitt place, he didn't see a secret anymore. He saw a record, a documented history, a warning that had finally been heard. His father had told him to remember. He had remembered, and when the time came, he had spoken. Not everyone had listened the first time, but the land had made them listen eventually. It always did. You could bury a lot of things, diesel fuel, tractors, mistakes, but the ground kept records, and sooner or later someone would dig deep enough to find them. The 6 Massey Fergusons had been underground for 70 years. They had leaked, they had contaminated, they had waited, and when the excavators finally came, they had surfaced like evidence, like proof, like a judgment on the men who thought they could bury a problem and walk away. The bank had learned. They had paid $9.4 million to learn it, and they had put Tom's name in the record so the next person wouldn't have to. Tom kept a copy of the remediation report in his kitchen drawer. Sometimes he would pull it out and read the cover page. The Holloway advisory, his name, his father's knowledge, his warning. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was proof that he had tried, and in the end, it had mattered. The tractors were gone. The contamination was gone. And the land, which had held the secret for 70 years, was finally clean. The valley remembered, even when people forgot. And sometimes if you listened, if you spoke, if you stood at the fence and refused to be quiet, the valley would make sure the truth came up. Even if it took 70 years. Even if it took 6 buried Massey Fergusons and $9 million in a bank that finally learned to listen. The land kept its records, and Tom Holloway had kept his promise.